This screencast is going to pick up with the emergence of African community. So, if plantation owners could help it, they would try to keep their African slave population diverse, so that they would all have different languages and cultures. And this was an effort to kind of prevent them from communicating with each other, which would prevent rebellion. Like, I guess the fear was if they could talk to each other, they could plan, to overthrow the plantation owners and the wealthy elite. But eventually these barriers would be broken down by the slaves themselves. Slaves would absolutely develop their own kind of new customs and languages to be able to communicate with each other, since they're spending so much time together and developing together. So the barriers would be broken down that were put in place by the plantation owners. Slaves had a sense of family. There would be families within slave communities. They would have, their own kind of ritualistic marriages, and they would have kids. They would practice their religion. Some embraced, Christianity, but others kind of maintained their Muslim beliefs, as many of the slaves that came from Africa were Muslim. Many believed in, they were polytheistic because they had multiple gods. But anyway, point is, regardless of what the plantation owners are doing to try to prevent them from communicating, they are communicating and they are developing a culture within themselves, as any natural human group would. Now, in terms of resistance, honestly, in most cases, slaves would not try to resist or rebel. There are a couple of examples. We're going to go into one in particular, but for most, in most cases, they're scared. They're scared of the repercussions or punishments that would be in place for them if they tried to run or if they tried to fight. So if they do any sort of rebelling, it's all usually under the radar, like silent forms of protests, like working more slowly one day or breaking tools so they couldn't work. But most times we don't see full rebellions. But in one example, we have the Stono Rebellion, which is going to take place in South Carolina. And essentially what happens is the governor of Spanish Florida, recall that Spain was controlling Florida at this time. So the governor of Spanish Florida basically offers freedom to any African slave within Florida. And as well announced, if you make it to Florida, you are also free, okay? So just generally think about your geography for a second. South Carolina is fairly south down the east coast of the U.S., Florida sitting under it. It's still a ways of a journey, and Georgia, Georgia is kind of in the middle of them. It's kind of a buffer between those two regions. But many slaves decide, well, we can try to make it. So a group of about 20 in South Carolina will meet at the Stono River, where they stole guns from their plantations. So they're armed with other weapons, and their plan is to march from plantation to plantation, further and further south, collecting more weapons and more slaves along the way to where they can build up a bigger group that could defend themselves and march all the way to Florida. Unfortunately for these slaves, the white militia would put the rebellion down and killed many of the rebels themselves to make an example out of them. So this rebellion was a failure, but it was an attempt at slaves seeking their own freedom. The significance of it, though, is that it's going to lead to stricter laws and rules in place for the slaves, to where they're not going to be allowed to meet in groups privately in some cases, so that plantation owners feel that they wouldn't be plotting a future rebellion. And they actually start educating their slaves on the English language and begin forcing them to speak in English. That way the plantation owners would know what they were saying, and they're not able to communicate discreetly, in their own hidden languages. All right, that's actually all I wanted to get through with the screencast, so we kept it under 5 minutes. If you have any questions, please write down what you have, and I will see y'all tomorrow in class, and then we'll review for the test.